¿Se oye ahora? Hola. Bueno, buenos días a todos. Antes de dar paso a esta primera sesión, a mí me gustaría insistir en el agradecimiento a AFIN por habernos acogido una vez más, y la primera vez como AFIN, pero bueno, personalmente tengo más experiencia, otras experiencias también muy gratas de haber gozado de su hospitalidad. Y bueno, para no retrasarnos en el programa, vamos a ir dando paso a esta sesión que lleva por título Orígenes, Raza y Etnicidad. El tema de los orígenes, que es un tema muy recurrente en la adopción en general y que sale continuamente, sin embargo, muchas veces pareciera que es un término muy ambiguo, ¿no? En el Convenio de la Haya encontramos el término origen, por ejemplo, en el Convenio de la Haya de Adopción Internacional, estoy hablando ahora, en relación con los países de origen, sobre todo con las familias de origen, y en algún punto también con otros temas como la religión o la etnia de origen, ¿no? Y en la formación de las familias es un tema en el que aparece también y se habla de que las familias adoptivas deben respetar los orígenes de sus hijos. Y sin embargo, pocas veces se explicita qué entendemos exactamente, qué se entiende por orígenes. Estamos hablando de un país, estamos hablando de un grupo social, estamos hablando de la familia de origen, estamos hablando de todo ello junto. En las adopciones transraciales, entendiendo como tales aquellas que unen a familias blancas con hijos e hijas no blancos, el tema es quizá todavía más confuso, ¿no? Ya Diana Marre había apuntado como resultado de sus investigaciones con familias adoptivas de niños y niñas adoptados transracialmente, cómo la confusión entre la raza, la cultura, la etnia, lo biológico y lo cultural era una constante constante no quiere decir que se repetía en todos y cada uno de los casos, pero sí que era una variable que aparecía recurrentemente, ¿no? Y que se asumía de alguna manera, apuntaba Diana, de forma automática, que los niños y niñas adoptados internacionalmente, sobre todo aquellos que habían sido adoptados además transracialmente, tenían una conexión automática con su lengua y con su cultura de origen, independientemente de la edad a la que habían llegado a nuestro país. Y muchas veces las familias, los padres y las madres, al hablar de ellos, decían que eran étnicamente muy diferentes. Esta cuestión de la raza y la etnicidad, que es realmente la confusión de un término con otro, que es realmente un aspecto muy marcado en el tema de la adopción transracial, no es solo en el tema de la adopción, o sea, realmente en España, como en otros países europeos, el término raza se ha sustituido por el término de etnia o cultura, por aquello de no reificar un discurso basado en teorías racistas y demás, también porque desde la genética se ha desarticulado el concepto de raza como una realidad con la que marcar una taxonomía entre los grupos humanos, ¿no? Atendiendo a que hay más variabilidad entre dos personas de lo que antes se denominaba una raza que entre dos razas diferentes. Pero, sin embargo, eso no nos puede hacer... O sea, en las adopciones transraciales, esa sustitución de raza por cultura o raza por etnicidad o por etnia no acaba de funcionar, ¿no? En realidad, cuando pensamos en las personas adoptadas transracialmente, por ejemplo, en el trabajo que hemos hecho con personas adultas adoptadas transracialmente en España, existía esta cosa de, por un lado, de su grupo étnico de origen, salvo determinados rasgos fenotípicos, apenas conservaban nada, no conservaban el idioma, ni la religión, ni una historia común, ni los demás elementos que configuran un grupo étnico, pero sin embargo su apariencia física, en un contexto como el nuestro, es un marcador muy claro de no pertenencia, de pertenencia a otro grupo y demás, con lo cual se producen aquí unas paradojas sobre el tema de las pertenencias muy interesantes, máxime cuando estamos en en un contexto cultural en el que tanto la pertenencia a la familia como la pertenencia a la nación se consideran ámbitos de pertenencia exclusivas. Uno es de una familia y de una nación. No somos, quizá, por ejemplo, en un contexto como el norteamericano, de donde viene Gina, es más fácil porque se habla de americanos de origen italiano o americanos de origen, da igual, de cualquier otro lugar. Nosotros no estamos acostumbrados a hablar de españoles de origen magrebí, no hemos hecho ese paso todavía, No me quiero alargar mucho porque me gustaría aprovechar que tenemos aquí a dos ponentes que han venido de lejos y que tienen cosas muy interesantes que decir, pero voy a pasar a presentarlas brevemente. Creo que hablará primero, según estaba en el programa, Katrien. Katrien es doctora en Ciencias Comparativas de la Cultura del Centro de Comunicación e Interacción Intercultural de la Universitat de Ghent, en Bélgica, y realizó su tesis doctoral sobre la adopción internacional o la adopción transnacional y temas de pertenencia en Flandes, en Bélgica. Ella trabaja desde una perspectiva crítica muy interesante, que bebe de las epistemologías feministas, pero también del pensamiento postcolonial y de los aportes de Foucault a la hora de pensar en la gobernabilidad y cómo nos construimos y se nos construye. Y ella ha realizado un trabajo que nos va a presentar ahora muy interesante con familias que habían o que iban a adoptar internacionalmente y transracialmente, y el trabajo que desarrollaban sobre su propia identidad y sobre la identidad de sus hijos y los límites y las posibilidades de este trabajo. Bueno, lo voy a dejar aquí, voy a dejar pasar a Katrien y luego presenta a Gina. Gracias, Katrien.
Good morning, everybody. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizing committee and Diane in particular for allowing me to participate in this conference. And I'm deeply honored to be here and in this panel on origins, race, and ethnicity in particular. Do you hear me enough? Yeah, okay. What I want to do here is to present my doctoral research. Which I have defended in May this year. And the title of my dissertation is Making Families, Parenting and Belonging in Transnational Adoption in Flanders. So in my thesis, I explore how adoptive parents both normalize and problematize the perceived differences of their children and families. And I examine what work is done and imaginations are drawn upon in relation to that difference. So I explore the identity work that parents conduct both for themselves and on behalf of their children. And as such, I think we can gain insight into how racial, cultural, and genetic diversity is metabolized within the private realm of the family. Oh dear. Something wrong. Sorry. So my research focused on parents living in Flanders, and so Flanders is the northern, predominantly Flemish-speaking part of Belgium. And I particularly focused on parents who had adopted children from Ethiopia, which is, as you know, an East African country. Okay. The official adoption from Ethiopia to Flanders started in 1996. And now 2 Flemish adoption agencies work with Ethiopia, and that is Ray of Hope and Flanders Intercountry Adoption Care. So between 1996 and 2011, about 761 children from Ethiopia have been adopted in Flemish families. And in 2007, for instance, adoptions from Ethiopia made up 50% of all adoptions to Flanders that year. And in 2009, 79%, so almost 80% of the 244 children that were adopted that year transnationally in Flanders arrived only from 2 countries, and that is Ethiopia and Kazakhstan. So Ethiopia is a very important sending country for Flanders. Now I'm going to say something about my methods and methodology. So I conducted qualitative ethnographic research from 2008 to 2011. And I used ethnographic research because this methodology is best suited for getting rich and nuanced answers to research questions. And ethnography involves the researcher's participation in people's life for an extended period of time, drawing on a range of sources of data and trying to grasp the meanings of human actions and how these are implicated in wider context. So I interviewed approximately 55 adoptive mothers and fathers and had conversations with social workers involved in the adoption procedure. So I did approximately 60 interviews in total, and 47 of these were recorded and transcribed. In addition to that, I carried out 30 participant observation sessions during adoptive parents' gatherings, and that were mainly information sessions. But I was not allowed to attend the compulsory information sessions, so only voluntary information sessions. And also festive and charity events that were organized by adoptive parents. I followed 2 adoptive parents' online discussion groups, and I also collected and analyzed documents. And last but not least, about 10 years ago, I adopted a boy from Ethiopia myself. He is 11 years old now, and he's my second son. I also have a son by birth, who is already 16 years old now. So these experiences of being an adoptive mother myself were also very important in my understanding of transnational adoption, and also facilitated entering the field and constituted an important source of practical knowledge. What the participants are concerned, they come from diverse backgrounds. So they work in diverse professions, live in both cities and rural areas. Some identified as Catholic, others as non-religious. Yet most of them are middle class, highly educated, white, heterosexual, and married. A minority of the mothers were single at the time of the interviews or in a lesbian relationship. The motives for adopting a child varied from infertility or illness, and some people also told me that they wanted to help an orphaned child. The number of children they had ranged from 1 to 6, and several families had children by birth and adoption. And some families also had children from different countries, so they adopted children from different countries. Their children's age varied from a few months to 20 years old. Okay, now it's better. Thank you. Where was I? Yeah, but most families had young children. And all families adopted through a state-recognized adoption agency and followed the adoption procedure prescribed by the Belgian federal and Flemish community authorities. No, I go in the wrong direction. Good. The ethnographic approach used in this study is theoretically underpinned by feminist and constructivist anthropological epistemologies, which posit that human reality is socially constructed and argue that knowledge production can only be obtained through a shared social experience and is dependent on the researcher's intellectual and embodied social positioning. This reflexive approach to ethnography rejects the idea of a single interpretive truth or a pre-established ontological entity that can be revealed, but takes a view of knowledge as situated. So I adopted a critical theoretical perspective, yet it is important to say that this does not imply a critique of the parenting practices of individual mothers or fathers, nor of the work of individual people who are professionally involved in the process of preparation and support of adoptive families. So what I wanted to do was to lay bare some of the unquestioned and accepted notions and axioms that undergird prevailing adoption discourse and practice. Yet these assumptions may be the very cause of the feelings of non-belonging, exclusion, and inferiority that many adoptees are said to struggle with. So by deconstructing so-called truths that guide adoption policy, and by unmasking their contingency and social and cultural constructedness, I aim at destabilizing dominant ideas in adoption. So I argue that these ideas tend to dramatize and pathologize the adoptee's condition, while at the same time they disregard or downplay the potential effects of an ideological framework that situates adoptees outside a sphere of real belonging. So in this talk I present my doctoral thesis, and I will structure the talk around the three main empirical chapters of this thesis. And these are the three chapters. And the first empirical chapter, Dramatized Parenthood, an Economy of Expertise, describes the economy of information that is organized for selecting, training, and supporting adoptive parents in Flanders. And the way this is organized and how insights from psychological theories are disseminated among and reproduced by adoptive parents is exemplary of what Foucault calls governmentality. So by this term, Foucault refers to the regularities of everyday existence that structure the conduct of conduct. So Foucault uses the term biopower to refer to a technology of self-discipline that penetrates the most intimate domains of life. Technologies of normalization create divisions between groups of so-called normal people who can manage their own risks and so-called targeted populations, those who require intervention and management of risks. And positive knowledges and expertises of truth associated with the so-called psi-sciences have played a very important role in the making of governable and self-governing subjects. So in current dominant adoption discourse, adoptive children and adoptive families are construed as such a targeted population, in contrast to normal children and natural families. What Signe Howell calls psychotechnocrat experts, such as educationalists, child therapists, and social workers, enhance the authority of psychological explanations for behavior, and most importantly, create and naturalize criteria of normality. And judged against these criteria, the adoptee is seen as deviant and highly susceptible to psychological problems. And in light of a naturalized mother-child bond, the adoptee is imagined as having been snatched away from that natural union and therefore believed to experience severe problems. So in other words, the very fact of being adopted is seen as an important risk factor for psychological distress. So I will not deny that some adoptees must cope with traumatic experiences, but I am critical of the current framework that is used for organizing the selection, preparation, and support of adoptive families, as it tends to pathologize adoption as such a framework that holds the adoptee, and I quote Triziliotis and Hill, hostage to adverse early childhood experiences, end of quote, is far too deterministic and can have serious implications for adoptees and their families. So in the second empirical chapter, Parents, Experts, and Intensive Parenting, I discuss how the economy of expertise influences and shapes the daily adoptive parenting work, and the parents' conceptualizations of the identities of their families, of their children, and their own identities. Prevailing intensive parenting ideologies tell us, and I quote Sharon Hayes, that children are innocent and priceless, that their rearing should be carried out primarily by individual mothers, and it should be centered on children's needs, with methods that are informed by experts and that are labor-intensive and costly, end of quote. So, first of all, these ideologies are invoked to justify the transfer of children from poor to rich families. Moreover, I argue that the global inequalities that are at the heart of transnational adoption produce uncertainty and feelings of guilt and indebtedness that drive many adoptive parents into charity work as part of their intensive parenting practice. So a strikingly high proportion of the participating adoptive parents in the study claim they financially support one or more, mostly Ethiopian children, through child sponsorship organizations, or donate money to charity organizations working in Ethiopia and elsewhere. Furthermore, several adoptive parents have themselves set up or actively participate in non-profit organizations supporting projects in Ethiopia. So here, for instance, you see some posters that announce benefit actions of adoptive parent-driven organizations, and there are quite a lot. Furthermore, intensive mothering ideology is pushed to extremes in adoption circles by dramatizing adoptive parenthood and conceptualizing it as in need of extraordinary measures that extend beyond the measures prescribed by normal, or so-called normal parenting guidebooks. It urges adopters to become something like social workers or therapists for their children, or semi-professional parents. And this dramatization carries the risk of reinforcing exclusionary mechanisms as well as domesticating difference. So, for instance, an increasingly popular measure in Flanders is to keep a child the first months after arrival isolated with the adoptive parents. So, some parents do not allow visitors during that period. They do not want, for instance, the grandparents touch their child, or they even do not want people have eye contact with their child. So it can sometimes be rather extreme. So this kind of parenting work tends to further underline adoptive children's and adoptive families' deviance from the aspired norm. It carries the risk of reinforcing essentialisms within the context of profound global inequalities, and this is due to its articulation with ideas that define the true needs of children in terms of exclusive parent-child bonds, and conceptualize the child's race as the mark of a different culture that both essentially belongs to and must be reinstilled in the child. And this true culture work, and this brings me to my third empirical chapter, which zooms in on one aspect of adoptive parenting work, and that is the engagement in the adoptive child's birth country by, for instance, eating out in Ethiopian restaurants or attending concerts of Ethiopian musicians. The culture work is often performed in the context of adoptive parents' festive or charity gatherings, as you can see here on the pictures. And the focus on the parents' culture work is particularly interesting as it reveals the battlefield of intersecting processes in which transnational adoptive families are shaped. It shows how culture is invoked for the negotiation of the children's otherness, and how this invocation of culture interconnects with discourses of relatedness, identity, and belonging. So these cultural celebrations are shaped by prevailing ideas on culture and otherness, and they can turn out to be empowering, or rather exclusionary, for Black adoptive children. So I have framed the adoptive parents' culture work as caregiving for identity. This is a term coined by Paul Kershaw. So and it's both as a way of cultural empowering their children, so as a way of guarding their children against messages that brand them as less valuable, but also as identity work for the parents themselves. By doing that, they can establish themselves as middle-class, involved, cosmopolitan, open-minded, good parent citizens. The adoptive parents' culture work is part of the whole package of care work that the adoptive parents perform. encouraged by prevailing parenting ideologies and as a way of empowering their children. The care work extends beyond the private sphere of the nuclear family and beyond the provision of basic care to encompass the production of cultural practices, social values, and identity. However, the parents and their children's specific position at the intersection of different layers of privilege and exclusion, in conjunction with the discourse of intensive parenting that tends both to challenge and to support the status quo, result in a very ambivalent practice. On the one hand, it can offer the children alternative conceptualizations of identity and citizenship, and can be interpreted as a form of resistance against exclusionary representations. Within adoption cultures, alternative identities for the child are considered and discussed. But on the other hand, it seems to be indicative of essentialist notions of identity and the pathologization of the children's hybrid condition, and risks becoming embroiled in essentialist imageries that assess physical appearance as a marker of non-belonging. Furthermore, the prevalent discourse in adoption circles traces adoptees' potential identity problems to an individual psychological struggle that stems from their being relinquished on the one hand and their ability to attach to the new and non-biological family on the other. Problems of belonging are thus addressed to a personal or familiar level, while the broader social context that has enabled the adoption in the first place and that works in exclusionary ways for the adoptee are not fully acknowledged. The embeddedness of the adoptee's experiences in a broader social context of unequal power relations and global unequal power relations and deeply rooted racism is largely ignored. As Barbara Ingwersen asserts, by placing the disturbance in the adopted child itself, by almost exclusively explaining emotional problems in terms of early infancy trauma and distancing them from the child's lived experiences of racism, parents and adoption professionals tend to ignore that the very whiteness of the parent and the imaginations and exclusions that go with it may be a factor in producing the adopted child's disturbance. The mere focus on problems of belonging on a familial or personal level moves the responsibility for the adoptee, him or herself, and as such does not challenge the status quo that excludes the adoptee from full belonging on a broader societal level. Okay. The intertwining of the parents' discourse with paternalistic neo-colonial imaginations of rescue, a colorblind negation of race as an everyday lived reality, and consumerist modes of engaging in their children's birth country run the risk of domesticating the global inequalities underlying transnational adoption. Celebratory representations of cultural difference, as Anagnost calls them, without acknowledging the uneven global relations that make possible the transfer of children, tends to keep white parents in what Zizek calls the privileged empty point of universality, from which they respect other cultures, but at the same time assert their own superiority. The capacity of such representations to empower the black adopted child is much more doubtful. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Kat. ¿No? ¿Se oye? Muchas gracias, Katrien. Como los tiempos del Congreso... ¿Se oye? ¿Ahora sí? Como los tiempos del Congreso son ajustados, si os parece, lo que vamos a hacer es dar paso a la intervención de Gina y al final de la sesión abrir un turno de coloquio, preguntas, respuestas, reflexiones que alguien quiera compartir y demás. Bueno, me hace mucha ilusión presentar a Gina, que ya hace un tiempo que nos conocemos y nos seguimos. Gina Bacon nació en Corea, fue adoptada por una familia norteamericana, estudió en la Universitat de UTA, donde sacó un máster en ciencias en el Departamento de Comunicación y actualmente trabaja en la oficina del decano como coordinadora de programa. Y hoy está aquí en realidad para hablarnos de su experiencia como adoptada transracial. A mí me gusta mucho, Gina, que ella habla de su de la vida de un Twinkie, y paso a aclarar esto porque es gracioso, pero puede llegar a ser confuso. Los Twinkies son unos dulces que venden en Estados Unidos, o que vendían, porque me parece que ahora hace poco cerró la fábrica, que eran como, seguramente recordaréis los bucaneros de nuestra infancia, que vendían junto con los ponis y los tigretones, que eran aquellos bollos amarillos que tenían nata blanca dentro. tenían una crema blanca. Bueno, esa es una... Ahí está. Una metáfora interesante, ¿no? Sobre esto que decíamos de cómo es el tener una apariencia externa de una manera y a lo mejor sentirse o haber sido socializado y sentirse por dentro de otra, ¿no? No quiero robar más tiempo para ver si conseguimos no retrasarnos desde la primera sesión, así que le cedo la palabra a Gina, cuando quieras, Gina. Bueno, sí me gustaría apuntar, perdona, Gina, que es interesante también tener a Gina en esta mesa, perdón, solo un apunte más, porque a diferencia de la exposición de Katrien, que está hecha desde Bélgica, que es un contexto cultural con el que seguramente estamos más cercanos en estos temas de hablar cuando se habla de la raza y de los significados que atribuimos a las diferencias físicas, raciales, Gina tiene una mirada desde el otro lado del océano, ¿no? En un contexto en que este sí es un tema del que se habla mucho más de lo que hablamos nosotros, sí es un tema que se tiene presente, que se trabaja, y por lo tanto yo creo que nos aporta otra perspectiva que debe ser por sí enriquecedora, ¿no? Ya está, Gina, perdona. Cuando quieras.
Thank you, Beatriz, and thank you for the conference planners for having me here. Can you hear me in the back? I think we're good? Great. So, as you can see on the screen, this is a Twinkie. It's a very American dessert. I don't know many people who like them, but they're very popular. And Hostess, the company who makes them, actually went bankrupt a couple weeks ago, and you can't buy them anymore because people have bought all of them and are selling them for thousands of dollars on the internet. So I couldn't bring one today, but I have some that look like it here, and you can see. So this is a Twinkie, and I am also a Twinkie. Yellow on the outside, white on the inside. So this is generally meant as a racist term, derogatory and bad, but I think it's an accurate description. I have black hair, brown skin, I'm very short, not even 5 feet tall. I look pretty Asian. Well, my parents don't look like me at all. They're Caucasian. Their race differs from my own. My exterior is like the yellow sponge cake, soaking up American culture that surrounds me. My interior is white, like the cream that makes a Twinkie distinct and full of flavor, but you can't actually see from the outside. Both parts never mix and block each other from being one solid color. In other words, my yellow body gets in the way of my white experience. At the same time, my white inside does not allow me to be fully yellow or Asian. Words like minority, oppression, and patriarchy describe my white inside. Describe my yellow outside. Words like privilege and patriarchy and dominance describe my white inside. Most people recognize race is not biological, but a social construct. However, at least in the United States, race still plays a very big part of self-concept because it's a very race-conscious society. In every survey that I take, and probably you too, they have little boxes where you check your race, white, black, all that. Well, it's almost metaphorical. By checking a box, you're being put into a box, saying who you are, where you come from, and where you stand in society. What box do I mark? Well, I check the Asian box, but fit better in the Caucasian one. But I'm Korean, so I should check other, which basically says no one knows. No. Well, Korean adoptees share a unique experience that most do not and cannot understand. And within ourselves, we all have very different stories, and I can't speak for anyone else but me. But I write to raise awareness and identify with other adoptees, and also to explore and challenge the connotations of race, identity, and stereotype. I use an autoethnographic approach because I live the experience of a Korean adoptee every day. Autoethnography, according to Meyer, positions personal narrative and lived experience as the text or data for a particular study. So by recalling memories of my life, my body is the text, in which I will explore the significance of racial identity, stereotypes, and performativity from an international adoptee standpoint. Definitions of performance have been expanded from the arts to a more inclusive position of performativity. Performance ethnographers assume that humans are essentially performing, which examines how people constitute and sustain their identities and collectively enact their worlds, their roles, and rituals. Performance ethnography is used to see how meaning, identity, and culture are made, how self and other are constituted in everyday life. So I use my body as a text in which to study how I perform race in a society that assumes race equals culture, and how people react to and or reject my performances. In 1986, in September, I flew to Seattle, Washington, in America, and was united with Teresa and Richard Bacon, mom and dad. Most people actually can see themselves in their parents. You might have your mother's nose or your father's eyes, but I can't do that. I don't know what physical characteristics were passed down to me. However, my birth mom did give me a name, yet that name was never meant to identify who I am in this world. McCarroll writes that naming is a rhetorical act that gives meaning to the abstract. Though names are merely symbolic, they carry significant meaning for people's identity. I have acted in theater a lot in the past, and I've never played Gina. I've always played someone else with a different name, different history. Similar to playing various characters, I perform a different person as Gina than the name given to me when I was born. Haeyong, Kaeyong, no. And I'm pronouncing that wrong. But that is not who I perform. Haeyong speaks Korean and was raised in Korean culture. She is Asian. Gina speaks English and was raised in the United States. Well, both are me, but the disconnect between my Asian and white names and self creates my Twinkie status. I perform both Asian and white. Alexander writes that performing race is ultimately performing self in the face of history and in the company of others, and negotiating the problems and pitfalls of claiming and maintaining membership. So what racial membership am I trying to claim? Who do I perform? Haeyong or Gina? And perhaps more importantly, what performance is most accepted? As a child, I didn't see myself as Asian. I didn't know what it was. Well, Willink writes that remembering as performance brings bodies into the present and offer possibilities for transformation. I have many childhood memories that made me realize I was different from the white population around me, but I will share one memory for you today. During my kindergarten year, I was about 6 years old. About 4 to 5 boys pushed me against a wall and started yelling things at me. And of course I cried and went home, told my family, and I remember my parents kind of laughing and not thinking it was a big deal. And I didn't understand at the time why they weren't more upset. And I don't remember what the boys said to me, but my mom does. She said that the boys were yelling, "You have a round face, you have a round face," over and over again. And that's the reason I was crying. Not because they pushed me, but because they were saying I had a different face than they did. My parents didn't have a big reaction because they didn't want me to feel ashamed for something that was true. I did have a round face. I shouldn't feel bad about that. Well, if the boys just vocalized what they found when reading my text, my body, why did I cry? It's because they pointed out my physical difference, like I was a freak, ugly, and unnatural. I would never look like them. I do not feel different from my peers until I cannot perform like them. My inability to perform white happens when I look in a photograph or see myself in a mirror. It happens when I go shopping and I have to buy kid clothes because I can't fit into adult sizes. I am just not like my white friends. My friends are tall, they have an eyelid, and don't have to stand on a chair to reach the cups in high cupboards. Participants of Frudlich and Lieberthal's study, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, of adult Korean adoptees made comments like, I felt like I wasn't pretty because I didn't meet the Western ideal of beauty. And another quote, I did not consider myself attractive because I was not Caucasian. To find beauty in my short brown body, small brown eyes, and black hair, while being surrounded by beautiful white women, is a difficult task. Well, supposedly, Asian women are exotic and submissive, but I can't be those because I grew up in the United States in a culture that aims for equality and individualism. People read my body and assume that I have Asian parents and can speak a different language. I cannot blame them or be offended because it might be weird to think every person of color is adopted. But my inability to perform Korean should not be cause for guilt or shame as it often is. People expect me to be Asian, but I do not meet their expectations. I get dirty looks when I ask for a fork in Asian restaurants. Chopsticks are hard. Come on, they are. And I've been shamed, verbally shamed, many times by people of all races, white, Asian, black, for not knowing and speaking the Korean language. I simply cannot perform Asian. I am looked down upon for that. I am a Twinkie and cannot be fully Asian, whatever that means. But I still try to make my Asian performances believable. When I embody Asian stereotypes, I feel more Asian. As a general rule in school, I always got good grades. And people always say, oh, well, that's because you're Asian. Good grades, you're Asian, of course. Well, unless there's a good grade gene, it's not because I'm Asian, it's just because I got good grades. But, you know, I've often found myself saying, oh yeah, it is because I'm Asian. It makes me feel kind of more legitimate as an Asian person because I met that stereotype. I embrace them, the stereotypes, because they make me feel like I belong. I find myself trying to perform yellow while simultaneously attempting to hide my white inside. My brother used to drive a car that looks like a street racing car. Big spoiler, dragons on the side, painted. And all racism aside, it looks like a very Asian car. He's very white. Well, one time we switched cars, and when I was driving around, I felt more Asian, and I wanted to drive and wave to other Asian people and be like, hey, look at me in my car, I'm Asian too. Physical accessories like cars, clothes, and hair influence people's readings of my body, which in turn influences my perception about my racial identity. I had straight bangs once, and my friend said, Gina, you look so Asian. Asian? Well, it doesn't really change. I've always looked Asian. But to them, it was just a reminder like, oh, Gina's different, because I'm just Gina to them. But my bangs, apparently this makes me look more Asian. I don't know. I identify with my Korean blood by creating an Asian appearance and embodying stereotypes, but I fall short due to my white inside. I perform both white and Asian, but neither are accepted. I look too Asian to be white, but I do not act yellow enough to be Asian. My inability to be one or the other solidifies my position as both. I am proud of my Korean heritage and my white family. There are a bunch of things, Swedish, English, German. I do support adopted children visiting their birth country, learning about the culture, but adopted children should not feel shame for not embodying a different culture than where they grew up. They are cultural beings of where they were raised. They're born in South Korea. I shouldn't feel guilty for not speaking the language. Atkinson and Delamont write that a narrative of personal experience is not a clear route into the truth. Such stories are intensely personal. They are thoroughly shaped by cultural conventions. So writing about my racial experiences does not end in a distinct conclusion about society, racism, stereotypes, or identity. But the journey of this paper raises awareness about the disconnect between skin color and culture. My white upbringing and Asian exterior make me unique. Though my friends can buy adult clothes, eat with forks, and can see their parents' physical characteristics in themselves, I can buy cheap kid clothes, I can easily tan, and I have the most loving family I could ever ask for. I am a Twinkie and do not want to be anything else. People in society have a difficult time accepting my yellow outside and white inside as a package, like this. But through giving my twinkified body a voice, individuals may rethink the way we label people of color. Thank you.